So there we go. Welcome, David.
Okay, hi. Thank you, Scott. And good evening, everybody. My name is David Fawcett. This is Addictions Q&A. So we really cover, the field is wide open for whatever you'd like to discuss in terms of anything related to addictions, whether it's sex and porn addiction or some kind of substance addiction. What I normally do is start out with a 10, sometimes 15-minute talk about a topic, which I'm going to do again tonight. And then we can open it up. The questions sometimes relate to the topic, sometimes they don't. So we'll just see where it goes. Tonight, I have spent the last couple of weeks mostly on the unit in Los Angeles, and just one of the issues that I kept bumping into out there, it's a very familiar one in addictions, is shame. And I just wanted to kind of go over some ideas about overcoming shame, because I think it's something that every addict faces, every addict deals with, and it's something that usually started long before the addiction was ever in place. And it's, I think, one of the ongoing issues of healing and recovery is shame. So before I get into the actual sort of tips to overcome it, I just want to talk about what it is. And there are two great quotes, one by Carl Jung, the great psychoanalyst, who said, "Shame is a soul-eating emotion." And I think that is so great, because shame, from our perspective, is just kind of this dead end. We talk about a shame spiral where you kind of drop into it and there's really no productive therapeutic value. It's empty calories. And it's just crushing. The other one that always I think is relevant is Brene Brown, who's done a lot of work on vulnerability and shame, who said the difference between shame and guilt is the difference between I am bad and I did something bad. And I think that's so important. It's something we talk about with our clients, where no matter what they've done bad things. But I think so many addicts come to mean that they are then a bad person and they're flawed somehow, really internally flawed, which is the essence of shame. There's just something totally wrong with me. And that's not a useful feeling, obviously. So I think everybody knows what shame is. I'll just say the difference between shame and guilt quickly. Guilt is really a feeling of feeling bad about having done something. In my mind, shame is this feeling of not that about what I've done. It's like who I am. It's this sense of I am flawed and somehow just essentially flawed. And it's a terrible thing. Shame, by the way, is taught to us. We aren't born with shame. Shame is something that's given to us. And one of the work I do with clients is to have them kind of give the shame back. And sometimes it's helpful, sometimes I put their shame in a pillow and have them throw it across the room just to physically release it. But I think shame is something that doesn't belong to us. And one of the distinctions of recovery, I think, is figuring out, okay, what's my shame? What's other people's shame that I have absorbed? Did I absorb my father's shame or my mother's or their opinions of it? So it's something that's really critical, because it affects how we view ourselves and the essential positive view of ourselves that we have to have for recovery. So that said, a couple strategies. These are like huge therapeutic tasks. I'm going to cover them very quickly. So the first one, for example, is to revisit your childhood, right? So all the shame starts in childhood, and it's given to us, it's taught to us whether by our parents, our peers, or the church, laws, cult, society. I mean, it's coming at us from everywhere. And so I think it's really important to go back and look at old beliefs, old false beliefs about ourselves, and old behavioral conclusions we made in the time we were children and didn't have many tools in our toolbox. What kind of things did we do? Maybe I decided to check out. I just floated away. And that's dissociative, and that really set me up for an addiction when I encountered drugs as a teenager. There's many other coping skills as well. So I think it's important to kind of go back and look at what those unmet needs are, and how we can replace them in a healthy way in our life. There may be unmet needs for approval, for unconditional love, for feeling worthy of love. All those things are messages that we absorb as kids, and they carry on into adulthood. So I think it's just really important. And as I say, I've said that with ludicrous speed, because that kind of deep work in childhood is a long, intense process. But I do want to mention that it's really important. The second one I think is important is to recognize the triggers of shame. Shame just doesn't occur spontaneously. Shame has a life of its own, and it starts with behaviors. It starts with certain things that are said, certain triggers. I think it's important to kind of do a post-mortem on that. Go back, how did I react to pain? How did I react to some emotional upset? And what just happened? What just went on there? And I think using that, what I call the observer self, to kind of take a step out of ourselves and watch ourselves and say, gee, that's interesting. Why am I feeling that now? What does that relate to? What's that about? And just to kind of be inquisitive about it, to really unearth those triggers that are there. And they're subtle and they're not conscious. When shame or any kind of reaction is triggered, it's not a conscious thought. It happens automatically. And so I think we have to, because it happens so automatically, we have to be able to slow it down. Even with my clients, sometimes we'll talk about freeze frame that. Let's just take this one frame at a time. What just happened? And work backwards as well with the feelings and the behaviors that triggered it. A third thing I think is essential is to practice self-compassion, to dealing with shame. And when we're feeling shame, when we're in that space, it's really hard to feel anything positive about ourselves, to feel good about ourselves. But I think it's important to really talk ourselves down and to take a gentle approach with ourselves. And I've talked about this before in these webinars, I like the concept of the inner child. A lot of people fight that, but it's a way of, I can separate out my adult self and this little vulnerable child that I often don't have much compassion for until I see him as a child that doesn't have many defenses, that's sort of hurting and shamed, and be kind to that person. And really, in essence, that's being kind to myself. But be a good friend to that person. Befriend that child. Let him know that he or she is not alone, and that they are worthy of love. And sometimes it takes saying that to ourselves to let us know we're a cherished and valuable person, and every part of us. So it's a matter of kind of reprogramming ourselves almost, and it really has to start with us. Oftentimes we want other people to do it for us. If we're lucky enough, we may have people in our lives that can do that. But if we don't believe it ourselves, we're not going to be able to accept it from anybody else. So it really helps to practice a little self-compassion. And there's some hormonal reasons for that too. When we do that, we not only get rushes of dopamine, we get oxytocin, which is this bonding neurotransmitter that creates good feelings and connection with ourselves and other people. And I would say almost of anything else, self-compassion is really the antidote to shame. It's the medication almost for a shame attack. A couple more I thought of, challenging thoughts. One of the things that happens with shame is we get what I call looping thoughts. That we start to just kind of get these thoughts that go around in circles, like constant revisiting situations where I felt bad or I felt shamed or felt somehow unloved. And every time we go through and recycle through that in our minds, we're reinforcing it. And I think that we can get caught in these loops that just are really hard to break out of, and they spiral down. That's where that word shame spiral comes from, because they really, it really does happen. So I think if we can challenge those thoughts that underlie that, and I'm talking about core beliefs about myself, and those core beliefs for an addict, maybe, I'm an unlovable person, or if you really knew who I was, you wouldn't like me at all, or I can never succeed in anything, or I'm unworthy of success or love, or all these lies that we've learned and told ourselves that I think is really important to be aware of. So that self-talk, the little chatter in our ear that is undermining us sometimes, to really identify that voice and challenge it and say, no, that's not true, and not to believe it. And also then to find evidence to the contrary. If one of my little self-talk is, you'll never amount to anything, well, gee, maybe I have to look at evidence to the contrary. Maybe what have I done? What am I proud of? What are my accomplishments? And kind of challenge these self-beliefs that when we're in that shame, they kind of go unchallenged. And so I think it's really critical to do that. Couple more. Sixth, avoid shame, what I call shame reinforcers, right? So there are people around us, people in our lives who kind of have this built-in shaming reaction. And I think for the most part, especially in early recovery, until I've built up some tolerance and resilience, I need to ditch those people. I can't have them in my life, all right? These are people that undermine my growth, undermine my self-esteem, are judgmental, and they may not even be aware they're doing it. But there's people with a lot of negative energy out there that if it resonates with my own inner beliefs, my negative beliefs about myself, it can really activate all that very quickly. And that really distances me from any sense of recovery or serenity, or it takes me out of the place I need to be. So avoid those shame reinforcers where you can. And then finally, to learn to receive love and kindness. I think one of the hardest things to do for an addict and a partner of addict often is to be able to receive kind words from someone, because oftentimes we don't believe it. We don't believe we're worthy of it at some level. We don't believe we could ever get it. And so I think when someone says something nice, it's very difficult to receive. And in fact, if I'm giving compliments, it's easy to do because I'm kind of in control. But if I'm receiving something nice, a compliment, and how many of us get a compliment on something, oh, nice shirt, oh no, this old thing. So I think we kind of dismiss. And I had to consciously learn in early recovery to say thank you, because what I wanted to do is just start counteracting it or mitigating it or minimizing it, and a simple thank you does just fine. But I think to really take it in and learn how to receive love and kindness. And then two more that are really related as one, to practice empathy and forgiveness for ourselves, forgiveness for others. I think we need to wash away the badness that we kind of believe we've had. And again, to separate, like Brene Brown says, the person from the deeds, and to really make that separation and turn that shame into empathy. And I think one of the things, and this especially relates to how addicts have treated the loved ones in their lives. I think we don't often understand the impact we've had. There's this lack of empathy. I think it's probably especially true for sex addicts and porn addicts somehow, but it's true of all addiction. And I think we really have to be kind to ourselves, forgive ourselves, but also make a tremendous effort to build empathy for the impact we've had on other people's lives, and to really be very gentle and loving with that, and being very, very tender with those relationships, because they've been wounded. And just as we are wounded, our partners are wounded, and two wounded people don't make a healed person. So I think to really be kind to each other and kind to ourselves. So that's a whole bunch of stuff. I feel like I kind of threw a bunch of stuff, a spaghetti bowl at the wall there. But once I started on this topic, I thought, gee, there's so many points I want to make. It's an important topic. So those are some tools. I would love to hear if people have other things that have worked for them, or what struggles they might have had, or anything related to that, or anything else. So thanks.
Yeah, for those of you who joined us late, today's topic is shame and overcoming shame. David gave us a brief definition of shame. It's a soul-eating emotion that the difference between guilt and shame is I am bad, I'm defective, I'm unworthy, there's something wrong with me. Guilt is I did something bad. Big difference. David, can you, since we're mostly talking about addiction here, can you talk about the process where shame links to addiction real quick?
Yeah, so I think again, shame is taught to us really early on, but I think what happens typically if a child is feeling shame, and then as an adult, they start to feel bad about themselves and create a lot of false self. So I'll use myself for an example. I'm a gay man. I was a young gay boy in the Midwest, in a really conservative place, a scary place, actually a threatening place for some young gay kid to be. And so I was really ashamed of that. And I learned that from everything around me. But I also knew that was really something I needed to keep secret. And I sort of built this false self around me that protected this inner vulnerable child. And that false self got, I did well in school, and I was a musician, and that got all kinds of accolades. But inside, I knew that wasn't really who I was. There's that thing again, if they really knew who I was, I'd be unlovable. And so that disconnect between that, in my mind at least, that outer self and this painful, shamed inner self, that's where addiction lives, that gap. Because I started to self-medicate to numb the discomfort of trying to juggle those two lives and to fill that void. And I think that's an expression in various forms we hear in addiction, where the drink or the drug or the behavior is all about filling that hole in here. And for me, that hole was this space between this shameful person I was and kind of trying to function in the world. And so I think shame, I think, is a setup for addiction, because it's so painful. Addiction is dissociative or distancing. It just allowed me to kind of live with this disconnect, these almost like two people that I was. So in my case, that's how shame played a role. Yeah, I don't know if that was your case or.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times I hear people talking about the hole in the soul that, we tried, there wasn't enough alcohol or drugs or sex in the world to fill that hole. But it didn't stop me from trying.
Yeah.
And, it really was feeling not good enough and unworthy, and also learning really early on that you talked about unmet needs. In my house, there was lots of food and there were nice clothes and we had nice cars and TVs, and there wasn't a lot of love. And there wasn't a lot of empathy or understanding about, I was allowed to smile and make good grades. Anything else, my dad just tuned out, and my mother overreacted and just lost her nut. And usually at somebody who had nothing to do with it, and often at me. So I learned that, my needs don't matter.
Right. That's one of those beliefs.
Yeah, it's, that's a negative core belief that I've had to work on. And it's that little tape, the shame tape, still plays in my head. It's tape number 1. There's about 40 of them.
The other thing I just want to say that I didn't say before is that we not only have shame about those things in our lives, we have shame about having shame. So it's like this compounded thing where people start to feel ashamed that they're feeling shamed, and it just compounds itself. It's an endless loop.
Yeah. And, any childhood trauma experience, there's tons of research looking at the links between early life trauma and addiction. We talked about this last week. But the sort of the missing link between those two things is the shame we have about the trauma that we can't tell anybody because they won't help us resolve it, or it's all sort of interrelated. By the way, everybody ask questions using the Q&A feature. This is for you. I have lots of questions to ask David, but and I'm going to ask one right now. Guilt versus shame. Brene Brown, I can't remember which book she writes in, but she says, guilt is a really good motivator for us to make change. Shame is the exact opposite. It will keep us stuck in our addiction. Can you explain that for everybody, David?
Yeah, that's a really great concept. And it's true, because guilt really, relates to things we've done as opposed to our core essence of who we are as a person on this earth. And so guilt, I think, if we can own responsibility for what we've done, the impact we've had, the things we've done, and this is especially true for the recovery process of an addict, guilt can really motivate us for change in terms of, I don't want to be feeling this terrible again. I don't want to have this impact on my children or on my wife or on my husband. I don't want to do these things. I don't want to be I don't want to be this person. And in terms of the things I've done as an addict. So I think once that kind of denial system breaks open and the addict, particularly I'm talking about now, starts to see the impact of what they've done and the impact it's had on other people and on themselves and on their soul and how they feel about themselves, it can be a huge motivator for change. Shame, on the other hand, is, as I mentioned, this kind of internal sense of just there's something terribly wrong with me as a person. I am flawed. There's just no useful benefit for me being on this earth. I'm just taking up space. And there's nowhere to go with that. I mean, that's the only motivator for that is to shut down even more or to maybe act out more addictively than before. But I think it's important to recognize that there's no good outcome that can come from shame, but guilt, when it's really understood in the proper context and taken for what it is as something, this is not who I want to be. This is not what I want to do. That can be a real motivation for change. But shame, that sense of being flawed, is just, that leads nowhere except more pain.
Yeah, I remember in my early recovery, I felt like I didn't deserve to recover. I wasn't good enough. I was too awful of a human being at my core to deserve recovery. And, if I caught myself smiling or laughing, I would feel bad about it. And it was like, this doesn't make any sense. I know this is all about, having a better life, but I don't feel like I deserve it. And it took me a long time to get over that.
Well, as you start to accept yourself and see yourself as a different person.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I was going to say, the other thing with shame sometimes is that sometimes people kind of embrace it in the wrong way. And if we get a lot of narcissistic tendencies with addiction. And so I think sometimes you see this phenomenon of like, I'm a worse person than you kind of taking place. Like drug addicts sometimes will say, have a hierarchy of, well, I used heroin, you only used cocaine, or whatever it is. And I think we try to outdo ourselves in the shame pile sometimes, but I think that's also a non-productive way of living.
My mother's now 80, and she and her friends sit around and they try to outdo each other with their physical ailments over lunch and bridge. So yeah, addicts do the same thing.
Right.
There's and this was not a Brene quote. It was one of the guys who worked for her and was doing a training, and I heard him say it. He said, shame, other people taught me shame. By the time I was about 10 years old, I knew how to do shame all by myself. I didn't need other people to shame myself. Do you see that a lot with, in particular, addicts and in particular sex addicts, David? Absolutely.
I think, as we've said a number of times tonight, it's taught to us, right? Shame is given to us. And it may be other people's shames that we absorb, or just shame about who we are based on the society around us. But kids learn very quickly to internalize that. And I think, to go back to my case again, there was a lot of homophobia in this little town I grew up in the Midwest. And I would say much sooner than that, probably by the age of 6 or 7, I was a very good student. I had successfully internalized all that shame and homophobia. I didn't need anybody else to say anything. I could do it myself. It was like a self-perpetuating shame machine that just kept going. And I think when we internalize that, we create the ability to just do those endless loops I was talking about, that's kind of devoid of reality-based thinking. Just our whole self-concept gets mired down in that. Now, that really feeds addiction, as we've said. I think it's especially true with sex addiction, where in our society especially, we have so many kind of uptight beliefs and moralistic proclamations about sex. And I think a lot of people still, even in this day and age, have a lot of shame about sex. And we see, and I'm not just talking about sexual minorities, but that certainly is the case, but sex in general. And I think so sex kind of goes, because it is a really important primary need, it kind of gets pushed out sideways sometimes. And that has a lot of shame as well, in terms of being, not being faced directly, not being faced with true intimacy, but kind of relegated to a different part of our lives. And that just perpetuates that shame. So I think one of the great aspects of healing and recovery is to really create, oftentimes for the first time, that ability to have sex and intimacy without a sense of shame. And I think that when I was doing my book, Lust, Men, and Meth, the title now is A Gay Man's Guide to Sex and Recovery. At first I was going to do reclaiming sex and intimacy recovery or something, but I was using the word reclaiming. And I realized my experience was not, I never had it and lost it. I never had it, period. And so I think that, and it was all about shame and sexuality for me. And I think that those two are really tied at the hip, joined at the hip, because they go often so together with sex and shame, for sure. And I think until that spell is broken with recovery, and I think one of the jobs that we need to do better in this whole field is really not just put kind of controls on sexual behavior in terms of recovery, but really start to integrate healthy sex. What is healthy sex? What is healthy intimacy? And start to teach that. And we do, I think, more of that in our program than most other programs. But it's something I think we need to not just stop at like starting to control this addictive behavior, but how do we do this in a way that's fulfilling for everybody and with a lot of love for the people in our lives and for ourselves?
Yeah, one of the things that I see with guys that I work with as a sponsor is, well, it's usually one or the other. Either they grew up in a house where sex was never talked about and relationships were never talked about, and they have a whole bunch of shame even thinking about those things because they're so wrong that we don't even breathe the word. I guarantee you, I never said the word sex in my house before I was, as a kid. Never.
Me too.
And then the opposite is, it's just everywhere. I had a friend whose mother used to walk around in a man's shirt and nothing else when we were there. And sex was never talked about in their home either. But, it was just, it's usually one or the other. It's too much or not enough. There's not that healthy medium of, let's talk about it. Let's talk about what's healthy, what's not.
Right.
And either way, there's shame.
Right. Because it's not addressed honestly and accurately and openly. And I think, there's a point at which to talk about sex with kids, but kids are observant. I mean, especially nowadays with the internet and applications, and kids know a lot by an early age. So I think it does everybody a disservice kind of not to be open to conversations when it seems appropriate, for sure.
All right, we got a question here. Excuse me. How does someone deal with shame when they can't deal with or even recognize other difficult emotions? They play the blame game to give the other person the difficult emotions that the addict should be dealing with. So kind of pushing difficult emotions off on someone else and never dealing with shame or any of the other issues like that.
Right. So I think one of the things about addicts particularly is that sometimes we don't tolerate uncomfortable emotions very well at all, right? And I think, or can't tolerate them to any extent. So shame is one of those. And I think if you're in that shame place, it's really almost hard to feel any other feeling. That kind of overrides everything else. You just kind of feel terrible. You feel like a victim. You feel useless and worthless. And I guess to sum up, just kind of feel bad. But it's really hard to have a kind of a full range of emotions. There's this focus on kind of negativity and being mired down in that. And I'm to someone who's in that place, just point out, this is not often a conscious thing. This is an automatic process where they really kind of oftentimes don't know what to do because they're stuck in that place and feel very helpless. But it's a learned behavior in a sense. And so if they can't tolerate taking responsibility or even feeling feelings, one of the very common defenses of dealing with that is to project them onto other people. So if I saw something about myself that I don't like very much about myself, I may choose not to recognize it in myself, but I'll see it in you, or I'll find somebody. I think I mentioned this example the other day, last couple of webinars ago, maybe, where if I am a little too shy and don't speak up, I might find somebody who's kind of loud and boisterous, really offensive. They get really angry, kind of out of scale with who they are. And the problem really is that I'm not accepting my own inability to be that way, so I kind of resent in other people. Or I have a feeling, the other case, I think I mentioned, I can't remember where I mentioned it, I think here, we see it often with homophobia and politicians who are homophobic. And oftentimes the guys that pass the most homophobic legislation inevitably turn out to be gay men or men who have sex with men, they're called prostitutes or whatever, and they just couldn't accept that in themselves, so they kind of project it out onto others. So it's a common phenomenon. It's important for the recipient of those projected feelings, whether it's a partner or a friend, to to reflect that back. I mean, to not take it, first of all, to not accept it as theirs, but to say, wait a minute, this is what I see. And I think I found it best to approach people honestly and directly. I try not to be judgmental, but I think, man, this is what my observation is right now. Take it or leave it. So I think just giving that feedback can be very useful to someone who's stuck in that shame space, because they may not be aware they're doing it. These are not conscious processes. These are all sort of automatic, sort of pre-conscious or subconscious processes.
So I wanted to ask you this question. By the way, everybody, ask questions if you've got them. I've got enough to carry us through the hour for sure. You talked earlier about figuring out what shame is your own shame and what shame you've absorbed from other people. I think you kind of touched on that with your last answer, but can you explain that in a little bit more and maybe give an example of absorbing someone else's shame?
Right. So if you're in a family dynamic, say you're a kid in a family, I had a case. Father was abused by his father, sexually abused, never really dealt with it, had a lot of shame about it, carried a lot of shame himself, and kind of radiated that shame to everybody in the family. And the son in that family felt it, kind of took it on as his responsibility. Kids absorb it, and they don't know the difference between what's theirs and what's somebody else's, and they kind of take everything in like a sponge. And so it's like easily transferred from one to the other, and I find it very useful exercise, by the way, to ask somebody if they're feeling shame, like describe it, what is it? How does it feel? And who does it belong to? Is that yours? Because it is, sometimes we can be carrying around like an attachment, and not even know it. So I think in that same process we just talked about with projecting feelings, I think shame can get projected onto others. So in that case, I just mentioned that father couldn't deal with his own shame, and he kind of projected it all onto his son, who took it right in. And so I think it's really important to be conscious of that. A kid can't figure that out. An adult who's in shame often can't figure that out without some help, kind of going back and examining patterns. And usually it takes a second person, whether it's a therapist or partner or friend or sponsor, to kind of walk them through that and say, well, gee, that doesn't sound like it totally is yours. It may be somebody else's. It may be somebody else's belief or judgments, or it may be their own shame itself that's been passed on. So families in that way are very fluid and dynamic, and all these emotions and feelings and defenses are kind of being passed around communally, and the kid takes that all in. And in that example, it highlights another phenomenon, which is intergenerational shame, intergenerational issues that can come over. I've had other clients who had a woman I'm thinking of, her parents were born in Germany, or were children in Germany during World War II. And they, after the war, emigrated here, and now, she's second generation later, but she still could feel the shame of that whole German experience. It was embedded into her family, and something she really was conscious of, and affected her life quite dramatically. So these things do have an impact over time.
So let me ask, the father projecting shame about having been abused himself onto his son, how does that manifest? And then what messages might the son develop based on that manifestation of the shame being kind of pushed onto the son?
So the way it manifests typically, as in it creates these core beliefs that we talked about earlier, right? These sort of skewed core beliefs. So in that case, as I recall,
this is in the father as the negative core beliefs that he's projecting, then giving to the son, basically.
Right. So, for example, the prime one there was like I'm unsafe. I am unsafe, or I can't protect myself, and a lot of that got projected on. So the son ended up having that identical core belief, although he was not abused by his father, and the situation was different, but it just kind of got passed on in the interactions and in the beliefs, and frankly, the projection of the father onto the kid in terms of his view of the world and how things were. So I think it manifests in terms of these core beliefs that people take in that are skewed, that don't necessarily match who they are and what they believe about themselves. It kind of gets projected onto them.
Okay, that's helpful. So my mother's a horribly anxious person. So am I. I'm convinced that I somehow got it from her, and I've never been able to figure out. I don't really care if it's genetic or if it's environmental, and it could be both. But some of it, at least, is probably environmental. She grew up in an environment, they were very poor. Her mother died early. You know, people were in and out of the house. She never felt safe. And even though I lived in a very different environment, I never felt safe.
I would guess that's a pretty clear example of what we just talked about.
Okay.
Because that's a core belief that doesn't really match your circumstances, right, as a kid.
Not at all.
It's like, what's that doing here? Kind of looking around at your core beliefs, it's like, whoa, where's that come from? So, yeah, I suspect that's the case.
So I'm going to go back to Brene Brown a little bit. Again, one of the books somewhere, it says shame grows in darkness. When we expose it to the light, it withers and dies, or I'm paraphrasing there. But and she also says, shame, we learn shame from other people. We need other people to heal our shame. Can you talk about the process of sort of talking about shame as part of the healing process?
Right. So I think probably the hallmark of shame itself is secrecy, and keeping it secret and keeping it hidden for fear that if it's revealed, we can lose our lives, we can lose our family, we can lose our friends, our standing, our legal status, whatever it may be. So I think that shame is something that we ironically protect with a lot of effort through secrecy and keeping it secret and not letting people know what's happening with us and with shame. And that goes back to kind of that looping I was talking about, where we get into these cycles in our heads, kind of going over scenarios about what ifs or what happened, but without ever really kind of doing reality checking in the daylight with someone else. And I think it's so true that we learn shame from other people, and really the only way we can kind of divest ourselves from it is to break through that fear of what's going to happen when we reveal it and share it with someone. And that's that crack of daylight that starts to heal it. And in my experience, once that turning point occurs, it can be healed quite quickly. Shame is this festering thing that does kind of grow in the dark. And I think the more light we could shed on it through honesty, through openly sharing with someone, through frankly getting feedback from somebody. And I think I certainly had the experience of several times in recovery, probably more than that, but once with a sponsor, I clearly remember, and another time sitting in a meeting where I thought, oh my God, if I share this, what I'm about to share, people are going to run from the room. No one will ever speak to me again. It'll be a disaster. I'll be shunned. And I did. And it's like, somebody's like checking their watch and somebody yawns, and several people come up after the meeting and said, yeah, I really related to that. I've done that too. It's like, wow. And suddenly I was not alone and not a pariah in the meeing. And not to say that maybe it wasn't a bad thing, but I was dealing with it, at least finally, as a motivator for change, as opposed to something to keep me locked up in that dark place. So I think dragging on the dead, having the courage to share it, and my God, what a relief, what a burden. Because I think in our minds, we build this stuff up to such a huge extent. Same thing when I came out as a gay man, and it was a little rocky with the parents for a while, but everybody else, like, yeah, we knew that 20 years ago, like, big deal, so what? It's like, really? This is what I've agonized over, acted out addictively for 20 years, and that's your reaction? So yeah, daylight really helps a lot.
Yeah, we talked about the difference between guilt and shame earlier. Everything in my life was shame when I got into recovery, and I had to start, telling my secrets. and having people not scream and run away. Before, and that helped me transform it into guilt, which gave me the motivation that I needed to actually make changes. You know, and my shame was keeping me stuck, and I was just building more shame. It was the shame spiral, just spinning around. I feel shame, I'll do something to not feel shame, but I'll feel shame about doing that, and you know, just flushing myself down the toilet.
Right. And that's such a perfect outline just stated, Scott, but from moving from that kind of endless loop of shame into breaking it open and then owning responsibility. You know, if I've done something, let me own responsibility as part of my recovery process. And that's where that guilt comes in, but using that as a springboard to make improvement and make amends or do whatever else I need to do. But at least that is a pathway out. With shame, until you share it and let some sunlight in on it, there's nowhere to go. You're just locked.
Yeah, and the key part of that process for me was the same as for you. It was getting it out. As soon as it was out. Now, if people had, you know, said and never spoken to me again, that would have been, maybe I would have gotten a different message. But you know, nobody cared. They had either done it before, or they just weren't that turned off by it, or you know, or they had their own shame to deal with. You know, that was different, but they would share it, and it really let me know that, oh, I'm not as awful as I think I am.
Right.
And I can change, and maybe I deserve to change.
And I think we need that from other people, because that's not something we can do for ourselves, to kind of talk ourselves out of it. We need that reaction from people. Yeah. And we need,
that's Brené's quote, where shame starts with other people. We need other people to heal it.
Right. And that has to happen with self-compassion too. We have to have some self-love and self-compassion for that process, because it's a very delicate process of kind of breaking out, kind of peeking out to see if anybody's going to reject us when we start to reveal who we are. But that revelation is such a critical piece of recovery.
I kind of feel like we talk about affirmations every week, but I'm going to ask you about affirmations and self-compassion. Does it work?
Okay, so I talked a lot earlier about these negative core beliefs we have about ourselves, like I'm unworthy of love, or I'm a terrible person, or I'm not safe, whatever those things are. And some of them, by the way, they're often rooted in reality. I mean, that was the situation, that was the takeaway lesson the kids had, but those no longer apply as we're adults. That's the distinction here. That, you know, when we get activated by trauma as adults, we kind of regress to the point where we're back as that 6-year-old with all the 6-year-old set of tools without our adult skills. And so I think it's important to be able to recognize when that happens. But so it's this core beliefs, and what we need to reprogram ourselves. And it really comes down, it's pretty simple, actually. It's just repetition and recreating new, healthier core beliefs about ourselves. And those are affirmations. That's what it's called. And so I've talked about this before. Anybody of a certain age, like me, remember Stuart Smalley on Saturday Night Live, and you're good enough, and you're smart enough, and people love you, and sitting in a mirror, which doing affirmations, right? And they really work. And actually, I recommend to my clients, they put them on a Post-it note, put them on their mirror, look at them every day, think about it every day. And what you're doing through repetition is just you're overwriting some of those old, outdated, negative core beliefs. And there's some structural guidelines for an affirmation. One, it needs to be present. I statement, like I am something, I do something. It's a present tense. It's not future. It's like, I will be a great person. You know, I am, you know, a loving person, worthy of respect, or whatever it may be. But it's an I statement, and it's done through repetition. And they are powerful. I'm always astonished if people do it with some regularity. We can quickly rewrite kind of the software in our brains that is programming some of these thoughts. So affirmations are really critical, and they're a huge tool. They're free. They're easy. We can do it anytime. anytime, anywhere. You can do it in the car at a stoplight.
Yeah, I find if I say an affirmation twice a day, morning and night for 2 weeks, I'll start to believe it. It'll start to sink in 2 weeks. That's considering, most of these shame tapes have been rattling around my brain for, 45 years or more. A couple of weeks to get some progress is pretty amazing.
And I think if you're coming from a place of shame, when you first start doing the affirmations, it sounds corny, you're self-conscious, sort of like, oh, this is stupid, kind of that kind of thing, but just really try to keep doing it. And very quickly, as you said, and within a matter of weeks, you can start to see some benefit of it. And change, and it's this really fundamental concept of how we see ourselves, like who we are. And that's a change from this seeing ourselves as this flawed being, not worthy of, a place on earth, to feeling more positive about ourselves. It's hugely important.
So, David, I think everybody on here is in 12-step recovery, even the partners, the ones I know who are partners of sex addicts. Step 4 and step 5 are very interesting from a shame perspective. Can you kind of walk people through the process of those two and what people tend to feel as they do 4 and then as they move on to 5?
Yeah, so step 4, of course, is taking a personal moral inventory of ourselves, right? And really that, I think, can be a scary process. It can be maybe a treacherous process. I know a lot of people get stuck on step 4, or else they start to get a little slippery and slidey with slips and relapses around step 4, simply because it's for the first time in the step work, in that progression, really taking a look at ourselves and what we've done and who we are. And I think mostly what we've done. And that's really, I've done different 4th steps over the years on different topics, but my first big 4th step was incredibly scary because I never really looked at that stuff honestly before. I always had a story. I had a story about, well, this is why it turned out that way. It's kind of a lot of responsibility, a lot of blame pointing, finger pointing. My first stab at a 4th step, I realized, my God, what a victim I am. Just sort of sitting in my victimhood, little crown sideways on my head. And so what I had to do, though, was really face a lot of shame about some of these issues, knowing that I was going to be presenting it to someone else and sharing it. Going back to the part we talked about where you share it with another person. And it was terrifying to me for all the stuff we've talked about. What are they going to think of me? Are they going to respect me? Are they going to even like me? Are they going to talk to me after this, after all these things I've done? And it kind of dredging this stuff up is a terrifying process, but it is all about shame reduction. And the part about giving it away really to a 5th step is it was incredible unburdening for me. And I had a sponsor then who had that kind of like reaction, like, oh yeah, okay. Yeah, I can relate to some of that. Don't relate to this, but I've heard about it before. It's just kind of normal matter of fact. It was incredibly liberating for me. So I think it's huge. I want to mention this other therapeutic technique that's done only in very safe kind of containers, but it really is the same essence of a 4th and 5th step. And it's in a safe group. It's terrifying too. I've gone through this. We had a chair in the front of the group. This is not something we do. It's seeking integrity, guys. Don't worry. But a chair gets up and people are seated, and at will you get up. Someone sits in the chair, and there's this whole exercise. What I wouldn't want you to know about me is, and just people talk. What I wouldn't want you to know about me is, I declared bankruptcy. I have HIV. I was sexually abused. I was an abuser. Whatever it is, and my God, that's so liberating to sit in a room full of people witnessing that and receiving that, and just holding the space while that person unburdens that process. It's a really powerful process. And in a way, the 4th and 5th step is just that, but it's with a 1-to-1 scenario. But it's powerful, powerful dynamic. Yeah.
And freeing, amazingly freeing. And also, I think it really helps it helps me build connection with people. When I meet someone new and I've, been to lunch with them 3 or 4 times and maybe a movie, and we're starting to become friends, I will sit them down and say, okay, they're all in recovery. So I just say, you're going to get step 5 here because I want you to know all the shit. And some of it's not pretty. And, if I think you deserve to know all the shit about me so you can make up your mind if you really want to be friends or not. I've never had everybody is like, wow, thank you for sharing that. And then they tell me their own stuff and we're much closer. It's bonding. I would only do that with people in recovery, but.
Right. But you make such an important point, Scott, because what an example of how shame keeps us locked up in isolation, right? If we feel that we have these secrets, we can't really be open and honest with somebody and form meaningful connections because it's a real barrier to sharing that stuff. So yeah, that's a great thing to do.
So, I said I had enough questions to fill the hour, but apparently I don't. We have 5 minutes left. Ask us a question. Or in the chat feature of the Q&A, tell us something that you feel shame about if you're brave enough to do that maybe other people, maybe one of those, I was going to take this to the grave secrets, if you feel the urge.
We do have a comment too, someone says, for about a year now, I've had I am enough written on my bathroom mirror in lipstick, which is great. I think a bathroom mirror is a great place to put these, something where we see each other or where we see it every day. And whether it's lipstick or a Post-it note or soap, I don't think it matters. It's just the content is what's critical. And
those of us who are shame-based, it was very hard for me to look in the mirror when I first entered recovery. I saw a monster in the mirror. That's a great point, Scott. And that's really true. I think people that are really shame-based have a hard time not only making eye contact with other people, but really making contact with themselves. And I did a lot of work with eating disorders for many years. And oftentimes people that were bulimics or compulsive overeaters would have mirrors in their house, never a full-length mirror anywhere, but the mirrors would only be like from here up, so they didn't have to see themselves. So yeah, the mirror placement in a house is a really interesting thing, but it can say a lot about shame and where the person's at. Well, we've got a couple minutes left, David. You want to just give us a wrap up about the ways that people can kind of combat shame? Yeah, so just a quick rundown. Things I wrote down, kind of at some point, I recommend therapeutically revisiting your old childhood stuff. That's really a lot of the trauma work, a lot of the historical work we do. By the way, once someone has a solid foundation of recovery, this is not the kind of work you want to delve into too soon because it's very triggering. It's the deepest work we can do. And I think we need to be in a good place when we do it. At the treatment center, we make sure our guys are aware of the trauma, but we don't really drag them through the work of resolving it. Right. If anything, we build skills to help them kind of be ready for that. But that's almost like a phase 2 kind of process. Recognizing your own shame triggers, practicing self-compassion, challenging those false beliefs that we carry around, and often listening to the crazy voice in our head and counteracting that, avoiding people who are shaming us, trying to get out of those shame spirals if we're doing it to ourselves, and learning how to receive love and kindness and really practicing empathy and self-compassion for not just people around us, but for ourselves as well. This is a tough process, and each of us is carrying around wounded little inner beings that need to be carefully loved back to health. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, David. Thank you, everybody, for attending. We hope we'll see you next week. Again, this will be online on our website. I'll get it up sometime tomorrow, and then it'll be on our YouTube page, Sex and Relationship Healing Forever. David, can you stay on for a minute? Because I need to do one quick little recording with you after everyone else logs off. Sure. Anything else you want to say before we go? No, I just said if people have an idea for a topic or anything like that, just write to me at david@seekingintegrity.com. Be happy to incorporate that into these talks. Yeah, that's david@seekingintegrity.com, or just hit the contact us button on Seeking Integrity or Sex and Relationship Healing, and we'll make sure David gets it. So thank you, everybody. If you're an attendee, I'm going to ask you to log off because I have to do a little recording with David here. So thank you, everybody, for coming. We'll see you next week.
Bye.
Stop this recording.